Think you know what the Ottoman harem was? Forget everything Hollywood told you. This wasn't some exotic paradise where women lounged on silk cushions waiting to seduce sultans. This was a prison system so sophisticated, so psychologically brutal, that it makes modern maximum security facilities look humane by comparison. The harem at Topkapi Palace held up to 400 women at any given time. Most of them would never see daylight again. They lived in windowless rooms deep inside the palace complex, their entire world reduced to stone walls and locked doors. These weren't wives in any meaningful sense. They were slaves, captured as children from Christian territories, purchased in markets, or given as tribute by conquered regions. Here's what nobody tells you about how they got there. Slave traders specifically targeted girls between 8 and 12 years old, young enough to be molded, old enough to be useful. The selection process was degrading beyond measure. Girls were stripped naked, inspected like livestock. Teeth checked for health, bodies examined for defects, virginity verified through invasive physical examinations in front of crowds of buyers. But the real horror starts after they entered the harem. New arrivals became slaves to the slaves. They scrubbed floors, emptied chamber pots, and served the higher-ranking concubines for years, before they'd even be considered for presentation to the sultan. Most died as servants, never advancing beyond the lowest ranks. And the babies, the ones nobody wants to talk about. Historical records from the palace archives reveal something absolutely sickening. The infant mortality rate inside the harem exceeded 60%, in a place with access to the best physicians in the empire. Because here's the truth those records don't explicitly state, but the numbers scream. Those babies didn't all die from natural causes. Female infants disappeared at alarming rates. Babies born to low-ranking concubines vanished overnight. Children with physical defects were never seen again after birth. The harem had a population control problem, and they solved it with methods that would make your stomach turn. Midwives later testified, after the empire's fall, about what really happened in those birthing rooms. Babies suffocated with silk pillows. Newborns dropped into water basins and held under. Infants who simply stopped breathing in the night, and nobody asked questions. The mothers couldn't cry out. Showing grief for a disappeared baby meant admitting you knew something was wrong, which meant you were accusing someone of murder, which meant you'd be the next one sewn into a sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. The psychological torture of this system was deliberate. Every woman in the harem understood that her child's survival depended entirely on her political position. Give birth without the sultan's favor? That baby had maybe a 20% chance of seeing its first birthday. Even if you were favored, having a daughter instead of a son could be a death sentence for both of you. But wait, it gets worse. The women who did manage to have their children survive faced a different nightmare. Those children became pawns in deadly political games they were too young to understand. Sons of concubines were potential heirs, which made them targets. Daughters were married off to consolidate power, sent away to strangers before they could even speak full sentences. This wasn't a harem. It was a breeding facility run like a corporation, where the product was royal children and the workers were disposable. The harem had a structure more complex than any modern corporation and infinitely more deadly. At the very top sat the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. This woman held more power than most government ministers. She controlled access to the sultan, managed the harem's massive budget, and could order executions without trial. Below her came the favorites, the handful of concubines who had successfully given birth to sons and earned the sultan's continued attention. These women lived in relative luxury, with their own apartments, servants, and jewelry collections worth fortunes. But their position was never secure. One wrong move, one suspicion of disloyalty, and they'd fall faster than they'd risen. Then came the middle ranks. Concubines who had caught the sultan's eye once or twice, but hadn't produced children, or had only given birth to daughters. These women existed in constant anxiety, knowing they were one scandal away from being forgotten entirely. They spent their days scheming, forming alliances, and trying desperately to get another chance at the sultan's bed. At the bottom were the servants, hundreds of them. Girls who had been in the harem for years, even decades, without ever being seen by the Sultan. They would die as slaves, their entire lives spent serving women who'd simply gotten luckier in the genetic lottery. The enforcement of this hierarchy required violence, constant, creative, terrifying violence. The Bosphorus execution was the most common method for dealing with troublesome concubines, women accused of infidelity, insubordination, or just being inconvenient were sewn into weighted sacks while still alive and thrown into the strait at night. Historical records show hundreds of these executions over the centuries. But drowning was merciful compared to some alternatives. Women caught in conspiracies faced torture first. The bastinado, where the soles of feet were beaten until they split open and bones shattered. Starvation in underground cells. Disfigurement through acid or hot oil, destroying their beauty and any chance of ever regaining favor. Here's something that will make your skin crawl. The palace kept detailed execution records, and they reveal a pattern. Executions of harem women spiked dramatically whenever a new sultan took the throne. Why? Because the previous sultan's favorites became political liabilities overnight. The new Valida Sultan would systematically eliminate her predecessors, along with anyone loyal to them. Sometimes dozens of women disappeared in a single week. The physical mutilations were particularly barbaric. Genital mutilation was used as punishment for suspected sexual misconduct. Women's reproductive organs would be damaged deliberately, ensuring they could never have children, even if they somehow regained favor. The message was clear. If you can't produce heirs on demand, you're worthless. And then there were the eunuchs, the guardians of this nightmare. These weren't willing participants. They were boys, usually between 8 and 12 years old, captured from African regions or purchased from slave markets. The castration process was so brutal that historical records suggest up to 90% of boys died during or shortly after the procedure. The method varied, but the most common involved cutting off both testicles and penis with a hot blade, then cauterizing the wound with boiling oil or a red-hot iron. No anesthesia. The screaming could supposedly be heard throughout entire neighborhoods. Boys were then buried up to their waists in sand for days while the wounds healed, if they healed. Infections killed most. Those who survived faced lifelong complications: incontinence, chronic pain, hormonal imbalances, and profound psychological trauma. But here's the truly sick part. Those traumatized survivors became the harem's most zealous enforcers. Eunuchs who'd suffered unimaginable torture as children grew up to inflict that same cruelty on the women they guarded. Some historians argue they were perpetuating their trauma, punishing others because they couldn't punish those who'd destroyed them. Others suggest they were simply products of the system, so broken by their experiences that cruelty became their only language. The head eunuch held extraordinary power. He could enter the Sultan's presence unannounced, controlled information flow between the harem and the outside world, and often accumulated more wealth than provincial governors. All this power, built on a foundation of childhood mutilation and forced servitude. This hierarchy wasn't just about organization. It was about making sure everyone understood that any woman, at any moment, could fall from luxury into horror. No position was safe, no favor was permanent. The only constant was fear. And the worst part? This system functioned for over 400 years, generation after generation of women and castrated boys, all grinding through the same machinery of exploitation, each new victim helping to ensure the next one's suffering. The harem wasn't just a prison. It was an arena where women fought each other for survival, using the only weapons they had: poison, manipulation, and murder disguised as accidents. The competition was simple and absolutely brutal. Only women who produced male heirs had any chance at security. Everyone else was disposable. Imagine spending every single day knowing that hundreds of other women wanted exactly what you had, and they'd kill you to get it. That was life for any concubine who'd earned the Sultan's attention. The moment you became pregnant, you became a target. Other women would smile at you during the day and plot your death at night. Poison was everywhere. Kitchen slaves could be bribed to add arsenic to meals. Servants might crush glass into powder and mix it into cosmetics. Slow-acting toxins that mimicked natural illness were preferred, because they drew less suspicion. Women died from mysterious fevers, sudden seizures, or unexplained organ failure with alarming regularity. But poisoning adults was risky. Too many questions, too much investigation. Smart killers went after the babies instead. A newborn dies? Tragic, but common. Nobody investigates too closely. Infants in the harem suffocated in their sleep with suspicious frequency. Sometimes a wet nurse would report that a baby simply stopped breathing during the night. Sometimes a child would fall ill with symptoms that looked like natural disease but progressed far too quickly. The records tell horrifying stories, but none quite as shocking as Kosum Sultan. She rose from captured slave to Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. Her path to power was paved with corpses of rival concubines and their children. Historical accounts describe her ordering the execution of pregnant women who might produce sons that threatened her own children's claim to succession. But Kosum went even further. When her son Ibrahim became sultan, she couldn't control him as she'd planned. He started showing favor to other women, threatening her power base. So she had them eliminated. Not one or two, dozens. Some historians put the number at over 50 women executed on her orders during a 5-year period. The methods were creative and designed to send messages. Some rivals were strangled in their sleep by eunuchs who owed Kosum favors. Others were accused of witchcraft or conspiracy and executed publicly, their bodies displayed as warnings. A few simply disappeared, never to be mentioned again, as if they'd never existed. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. Kosum wasn't an exception. She was just better documented than most. Every Valide Sultan played similar games. Every favorite concubine schemed against rivals. The system required it. If you weren't actively eliminating threats, you were the threat being eliminated. The psychological warfare was perhaps worse than the physical violence. Women formed alliances that could shatter overnight. A friend today might be bribed tomorrow to testify against you in some manufactured conspiracy. Trust was impossible, but isolation meant vulnerability, so everyone played elaborate social games where every conversation was a potential trap. Servants were caught in the middle of these wars, forced to choose sides or risk being accused of disloyalty by everyone. Many servants became informants, reporting private conversations to multiple mistresses simultaneously, playing all sides in hopes of staying alive. The paranoia became so extreme that some concubines stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through written notes they'd burn immediately after reading. But wait, it gets worse. The competition extended beyond just securing the Sultan's favor. Women fought over living quarters, servant assignments, jewelry allowances, even food quality. Higher-ranking concubines could make lower-ranking ones' lives unbearable through petty cruelties, denying them clean water, forcing them to sleep in cold rooms, ensuring they received spoiled food. Some women broke under the pressure. Historical accounts describe concubines who went mad from the constant stress, attacking other women randomly, screaming about conspiracies, or retreating into catatonic states where they'd sit motionless for days. These women were quickly removed to isolated chambers where they'd spend the rest of their lives forgotten, their minds shattered by a system that demanded everyone be a murderer or a victim. And the children who survived this nightmare? They grew up understanding that their mothers had killed to keep them alive, that their very existence had cost other children their lives. Some sons became cruel sultans who perpetuated the system. Some daughters became scheming Valide sultans who'd do anything to protect their own sons. The cycle fed itself, generation after generation, each new victim eventually becoming a victimizer. The competition never ended. Even elderly former favorites who'd been pushed aside weren't safe. If a new Valide sultan saw them as potential threats, or simply wanted to tie up loose ends from old conflicts, those women could still be executed decades after their last contact with power. This wasn't political intrigue in the way history books romantically describe it. This was pure survival mode, where women used murder as a career advancement tool and infanticide as a strategic option. The harem transformed human beings into calculating killers who'd strangle a baby if it meant their own child might live. If you think the concubines had it bad, wait until you understand what happened to the boys who became eunuchs. These weren't volunteers. They were children, ripped from their families and subjected to mutilation so extreme that calling it anything other than torture would be a lie. The Ottoman Empire needed thousands of eunuchs to guard the harem and serve in various palace functions. That demand created an entire industry of castration centers, primarily in Egypt and other African regions. Slave traders would purchase or capture boys specifically for this purpose, knowing that the survivors would fetch premium prices from Ottoman buyers. The castration process was designed to be as complete as possible, removing both testicles and penis entirely. This wasn't about preventing reproduction. Removing just the testicles would have accomplished that. Full castration was about power and control, about creating human beings who were permanently marked as less than whole. The procedure went like this. Boys were held down by multiple men, while a specialist used a curved blade to cut away all external genitalia in one motion. The screaming was so intense that boys often lost consciousness from pain alone. The wound was then cauterized with boiling oil or a red-hot metal plate pressed directly against the raw flesh. The smell of burning skin and tissue was reportedly overwhelming. Afterward, boys were buried up to their waists in hot sand or manure, which supposedly helped the wound heal, but more often just caused infections. They couldn't urinate normally for weeks. A bamboo catheter was inserted into the urethra, and if that got blocked or infected, the boy died in agony from bladder rupture or sepsis. The survival statistics are horrifying. Historical records suggest that between 80 and 90% of boys subjected to full castration died within the first month. They bled to death, died from infections, or simply went into shock that their bodies couldn't recover from. The castration centers were essentially death factories where boys were processed like livestock, and the few who survived were the lucky ones. Think about that for a moment. 9 out of 10 boys died screaming in unimaginable pain, and the one who survived got to spend the rest of his life physically and psychologically damaged, serving the same system that had destroyed him. The physical effects of castration were permanent and devastating. Eunuchs couldn't control their bladders properly, often wetting themselves throughout their lives. They developed hormone imbalances that caused weight gain, breast development, and loss of muscle mass. Their voices never deepened naturally, but instead developed an unusual quality that marked them as castrated. They suffered chronic pain at the mutilation site, especially as scar tissue formed and tightened. But the psychological damage might have been even worse. These were children when it happened to them. 8, 10, 12 years old enough to remember having intact bodies, young enough that the trauma permanently altered their developing brains. Many eunuchs became emotionally stunted, incapable of forming genuine emotional connections, driven by control and cruelty, because those were the only emotions they understood. And here's where it gets truly twisted. Those traumatized boys grew up to become the harem's enforcers. The chief black eunuch was one of the most powerful people in the empire, controlling access to the sultan and managing all harem affairs. Lesser eunuchs served as guards, spies, and executioners. They were the ones who sewed women into sacks and threw them into the Bosphorus. They were the ones who strangled babies on orders. They were the ones who dragged screaming concubines to torture chambers. Victims became perpetrators. Boys who'd been mutilated and traumatized grew into men who inflicted that same trauma on others. Some historians argue they were acting out their rage on the only people more powerless than themselves. Others suggest the system had broken them so completely that they simply couldn't conceive of any other way to exist. But wait, it gets worse. Eunuchs couldn't have families, couldn't have sexual relationships in any conventional sense, couldn't even leave the palace grounds without permission. Their entire identity was bound to the harem. They accumulated wealth and power, yes, but they were still prisoners, gilded prisoners with authority over other prisoners, but prisoners nonetheless. Some eunuchs tried to create surrogate families by adopting young slave boys, grooming them for eventual castration and palace service. They'd perpetuate the same cycle that had destroyed them, unable to imagine any other future for the children they claimed to care about. The system was so deeply internalized that victims recruited new victims. The medical complications continued throughout their lives. Many eunuchs developed urinary tract infections that never fully healed, leaving them in constant discomfort. Some experienced bone density loss and developed skeletal problems. Depression was rampant, with accounts of eunuchs committing suicide by throwing themselves from palace walls or drinking poison. And despite all their power and wealth, eunuchs were never truly respected. They were tools, useful, but ultimately disposable. When a new sultan took the throne, he'd often purge the previous administration's eunuchs, either executing them or forcing them into exile. All that accumulated power could vanish overnight, leaving elderly castrated men with nowhere to go and no identity beyond the palace that had discarded them. The cruelest irony? The system that mutilated these boys told them they were blessed. Religious authorities issued decrees claiming that eunuchs were pure, that their castration made them holier, that they should be grateful for the opportunity to serve in the palace. Torture was repackaged as blessing, and some eunuchs internalized this so deeply that they genuinely believed they were fortunate. This wasn't just institutional cruelty. This was a machine that took traumatized children and transformed them into trauma-inflicting adults, ensuring that every generation's suffering would feed the next generation's capacity for cruelty. Not every woman in the harem died dramatically. Some faced a fate arguably worse than execution, being forgotten alive. These were the concubines who aged past usefulness, who never bore children, or who simply fell out of favor and became invisible within the palace walls. The harem had a brutal expiration date for women. Once a concubine reached her 30s without producing an heir, her value dropped to nothing. The sultan had no interest in older women when fresh young girls arrived constantly. Former favorites watched their status crumble as younger replacements took their places in the sultan's bed and in the palace hierarchy. These discarded women faced several possible fates, none of them good. Some were married off to palace officials or provincial administrators, essentially being handed over like used furniture to men who wanted the prestige of a connection to the imperial harem. These marriages were rarely happy. The women had spent their entire adult lives in isolation, with no preparation for life outside palace walls, no understanding of how to run a household or interact with normal society. But that was actually the better option. Many forgotten concubines were simply locked away in remote sections of the palace and left there. The Topkapi Palace complex was massive, full of unused chambers and forgotten corridors. Women who'd once dined on delicacies and worn silk now lived in these abandoned rooms, their basic needs barely met by servants who resented having to care for worthless former concubines. Historical accounts from palace workers describe discovering these women decades later. Some had gone completely mad from isolation, talking to themselves, covered in their own waste because no one had cleaned their rooms in months or years. Their hair had grown long and matted. Their bodies had deteriorated from lack of proper food and movement. They'd been literally forgotten, locked in rooms that other palace residents walked past daily without remembering anyone lived inside. Here's what makes this even more horrifying. Some of these women had once been powerful. They'd been favorites, had worn jewels worth fortunes, had commanded servants, and influenced policy. But the moment they stopped being useful, they became less than nothing. No one recorded their deaths. No one mourned them. They just disappeared from official records as if they'd never existed. The psychological torture of this slow erasure might have been worse than a quick execution. At least execution was acknowledgement that you'd mattered enough to kill. Being forgotten meant you'd never mattered at all. Women who'd spent their youth fighting desperately for relevance ended their lives as breathing ghosts, alive but already erased from history. Some women tried to escape this fate by becoming servants to younger concubines, trading their dignity for basic survival. Former favorites became essentially slaves again, cleaning chambers and emptying chamber pots for women who would eventually suffer the same fate. Others attempted to maintain relevance through scheming and politics, but without the Sultan's favor backing them, they had no real power and were easily crushed by younger rivals. The palace kept these women alive out of a twisted sense of propriety. Executing them would require acknowledging they existed and explaining why they deserved death. Letting them rot in forgotten chambers required no paperwork, no explanations, no one taking responsibility. It was administrative efficiency applied to human disposal. But wait, it gets worse. Some of these forgotten women had children who'd been sent away or died young. They lived with the knowledge that they'd murdered rivals' babies, destroyed other women's lives, all to protect children who were gone anyway. The guilt and grief, combined with decades of isolation, broke whatever remained of their sanity. Palace records occasionally mention servants finding corpses in sealed rooms, women who died months or even years earlier without anyone noticing. The bodies would be in advanced stages of decomposition, sometimes partially consumed by rats. These women had screamed for help until their voices gave out, had scratched at locked doors until their fingers bled, had died alone in darkness without even the dignity of a witness to their final moments. And the cruelest part? New concubines were never told about these forgotten women. They fought and schemed and murdered just like the generations before them, never knowing that even success was temporary, that every favorite eventually became forgotten, that the palace would consume them just as completely as it had consumed thousands before them. The system was designed to ensure that no woman ever felt secure enough to stop competing. The forgotten ones served as invisible warnings. This is your future if you fail, but no one will tell you that failure is inevitable because they need you to keep playing the game. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century and the palace was open to investigators, they discovered horrors that made even the documented cruelties seem understated. The physical evidence told stories that the sanitized historical records had concealed. They found the wells first, deep cisterns beneath the harem complex that should have contained only water. Instead, they contained bones, hundreds of tiny skeletons, infant remains piled in layers that suggested centuries of disposal. These weren't burial sites with any dignity. These were dumping grounds where unwanted babies had been thrown like garbage. Forensic examination of the bones revealed that many infants had died violently, crushed skulls suggesting they'd been beaten to death, neck vertebrae showing strangulation marks. Some skeletons were so small they couldn't have survived outside the womb for more than hours before being killed. The sheer number was staggering. Investigators stopped counting after reaching 500 infant skeletons in a single cistern. The chambers told their own grotesque stories. Rooms that historical records listed as beauty parlors or leisure spaces were revealed to be torture chambers. Walls showed scratch marks where women had clawed at stone until their fingers broke. Chains embedded in walls with remnants of silk scarves, evidence that women had been restrained there for extended periods. Burn marks on floors where hot irons had been used, not for styling hair, but for punishing flesh. One room in particular haunted the investigators. It was a small chamber deep in the harem complex with no windows and only one entrance. The door could only be locked from the outside. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of 3 women still wearing the jewelry of high-ranking concubines. The door had been sealed with brick on the outside, suggesting these women had been walled in alive and left to die of dehydration and starvation. But the most disturbing discovery was in the Valid Sultan's private quarters. Behind a false wall, investigators found a notebook. It was a ledger, written in Ottoman Turkish, documenting executions. Not official state executions, but private ones. Names, dates, methods, and reasons. The reasons were chilling in their banality. Too ambitious, spoke disrespectfully, became pregnant at inconvenient time, knew too much about previous incidents. The ledger covered a 15-year period during the 17th century and listed over 200 women executed on the Valide Sultan's personal orders. Most were drowned in the Bosphorus. Some were strangled. A few were poisoned over extended periods, with notes about which substances worked best and how long they took to kill. This wasn't the work of a monster. This was bureaucratic murder, recorded with the same mundane detail as household expenses. The medical examinations of the final generation of harem women, though still alive when the empire fell, revealed the physical cost of the system. Women in their 40s with bodies that looked 70 years old. chronic infections from forced pregnancies and primitive obstetric care, psychological trauma so severe that many could never adapt to life outside the palace walls. Several committed suicide within months of being freed, unable to cope with a world they'd never been prepared to enter. The eunuchs fared no better. The last generation of castrated servants faced particular cruelty. Too old to work, with no family to support them, many ended up as beggars on Istanbul's streets. Turkish citizens who'd once bowed to their authority now spat on them, seeing them as symbols of imperial corruption. Some were beaten to death by angry mobs who blamed them for the empire's fall. Most died in poverty, their accumulated wealth confiscated by the new government. The palace itself became a museum, but for decades, certain sections remained closed to the public. The authorities claimed they needed restoration, but the real reason was simple: the evidence was too disturbing. They eventually sanitized the worst rooms, removing the physical traces of torture and murder, rewriting the story to be more palatable for tourists. Here's the final grotesque irony. The Ottoman harem operated for over 400 years. Tens of thousands of women and boys passed through its system. Thousands were murdered, mutilated, or driven insane. All this suffering was justified by claims of necessity, tradition, and religious propriety. But when the empire collapsed, it fell not because of external enemies, but because it had rotted from within. The system that had seemed so powerful, so permanent, so essential to imperial stability, had actually been destroying the empire's foundation all along. Sultans raised in the harem's toxic environment became weak rulers. Political intrigue replaced competent governance. Resources that should have gone to military and infrastructure were spent maintaining a massive apparatus of sexual slavery and population control. The harem was supposed to ensure the dynasty's continuation by producing heirs in controlled circumstances. Instead, it produced damaged sultans from traumatized mothers, ruling over an empire that was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own cruelty. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, most people still don't know the truth. Popular culture romanticizes the harem as exotic and sensual. Historical dramas portray it as a place of political intrigue and forbidden romance. The reality, the torture chambers and infant skeletons and women dying forgotten in locked rooms, remains largely hidden. The Ottoman harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was an industrial-scale human rights catastrophe that operated for centuries under the protection of power and tradition. It proved that humans are capable of systematizing cruelty so thoroughly that horror becomes mundane, that torture becomes administrative procedure, that murder becomes career strategy. The women and boys who suffered in that system deserved better than to have their agony repackaged as entertainment. They deserved better than to be remembered as exotic footnotes in history. They deserved to be recognized as what they were, victims of one of history's most efficient machines for converting human beings into commodities, then grinding them into dust when they stopped being profitable. The palace still stands in Istanbul, beautiful and historic, drawing millions of tourists who walk through the harem section taking selfies, never knowing they're standing in rooms where children were murdered, where women were tortured, where an entire civilization's darkest impulses were given architectural form. That's the real hidden side of the Ottoman harem that you were never told. Not the silk cushions and exotic beauty, but the bones beneath the floor and the screams that no one bothered to record.